Oh boy, another day, another time to play top tier. I can't wait to play all the maps. We got all this variety. We got Denmark and we've got Denmark. This has been the reality of playing the game at non-peak hours lately is oops, all Denmark. Boy, howdy, I'm sure that this top tier Fox 3 gameplay is going to be very fun, exciting, and dynamic, and everyone really thoroughly enjoys this. Surely the enemy team isn't going to spend the entire game 0 meters off the deck flying directly into Fox 3 missiles and multipathing them, and then quit the game after 10 minutes because someone finally has thumbs. I'm having so much fun and I'm definitely not crashing out. This is Beer Thunder, and just like the rest of the Sim community, I don't even think we're crashing out. I think we have already crashed out because Sim is dying, and this is Beer Thunder, and I have facts and logic to back that up. Anyways, that was a real mess of an intro, and if you guys haven't noticed, I haven't been uploading a lot recently. I've kind of fallen off. I've become less active in my desire to produce videos, and a large part of it is because anecdotally speaking, Sim has felt like a ghost town over the last 2 months. This is actually especially noticeable if you play the game during non peak hours. So, if you're playing during a weekday in the evening, you're going to see a lot less games. The reason that it feels like a ghost town, though, is because Sim has experienced a major crashing out. The game mode is practically on life support. Anyways, let's talk about how I reached that conclusion because that is a bold conclusion to make without a lot of evidence. If you're just going to go based on anecdotes of going, well, I loaded up the game on a Friday night and the game seemed dead, and that's not exactly how good research works. And in doing research, I used a lot of the data that is available from StatShark because StatShark will keep track of the number of sim games per month, and we have a data set that represents about 3 months of gameplay, and that 3 months of gameplay coincides with the introduction of the SU-30 and the F-18, and we can kind of see a little bit of how the community has reacted to it. And basically, what I did with the StatShark numbers is I compiled them into an Excel spreadsheet to make comparisons because these comparisons aren't directly available on StatShark. The raw data is, but they don't do the charts themselves. I had to come up with these charts. So the first thing I did was a fairly in-depth analysis of the current state of top tier and how things have changed with the introduction of new planes like the SU-30 and the F-18, and how the player base and how player habits have adapted to that. And what I did initially was I compiled the number of games for every 13.3 to 14.0 from February to March, March to April, and April to May, and then I separated them into whether or not they're red team planes, blue team planes, or planes that can flex on either side. So your green line here is nations like France, Sweden, Japan, basically those nations that kind of like float around. Whereas red team is usually Russia and China, and then Germany as well. And then blue team is basically USA, Great Britain, and Israel. And kind of like the biggest trend that you can see is that the number of games that are played per month on blue team exclusive planes like the F-16C, F-15C, all of those planes, those numbers have plummeted by a lot. The other thing to notice is that even though the blue team numbers have plummeted, the red team numbers have stayed about the same for the first month, and then they have also declined. The same thing for planes that are on the flex side, planes like the Mirage 2000, Rafale, all of the Eurofighters. The number of games that have been played by those planes have also declined. One of the things to keep in mind too is that from March to April there was an airplane build event for the Meteor Mark 8 in the Israeli tech tree, which means that you would expect to see an increase in the number of games in Sim just due to the build event, just due to people grinding. But it turns out that I don't think that that had a large influence because I don't think a lot of people really wanted that plane because it's a repeat of a British premium plane and it's a repeat of a plane that is already in the French tree. It is one of those planes that people just weren't excited about. It just doesn't really do anything as far as getting you into the tiers that you want to play, and it also just doesn't have any resale value. So I think a lot of people didn't grind for it, but you also didn't see that spike in sim. You did see a little bit of a spike in RB in the March to April range, but you just did not see it in sim. One of the things that I did with the data was, instead of just doing the raw numbers, was comparing the numbers based on a percentage of the total, so that we could kind of get like a better picture of how things have changed over time. Because the previous graph kind of shows that red team kind of flatlined, blue team declined. But how do those numbers compare as a percentage of the whole? Back in February and March, 60% of the games were played by planes that were only ever on the blue team. And over time, that number has steadily declined. It hasn't declined that much. Even the most recent numbers, April to May, around 54-55% of the games are still played by planes that are exclusively on the blue team. But the other thing you can see here is that there's a pretty steady rise in red team only planes. And namely, the kind of the biggest growth here really does come from the SU-30. Far and away, the most popular nations for airsim still boils down to USA and Russia, and then everyone else is basically playing second fiddle. It's actually really easy to see this when you break the numbers down by the specific planes and not just by the national faction and the side that they're going to kind of end up on. Basically, what you can see here is that in February to March, the most popular plane, the one that accounted for over 25% of the games tracked on StatShark, was the F-16C, followed by the F-15E and the F-15C. Now, keep in mind, at this point, I think the meta was kind of established that the F-15E and the F-15C, while they're good AMRAAM slingers, they weren't nearly as versatile. And I think a lot of American players decided to fall back on the F-16C as kind of the most viable all-around top tier fighter. One of the other interesting things here is that if you look at the German Eurofighter flight numbers and compare them to the Rafale flight numbers, as far as popularity is concerned, both of these planes are basically equal. If you take all of the Eurofighters and add them together, you basically end up with a plane that is equal in popularity, at least as far as games are played, as the Su-27SM. Now, once we move in that March to April timeframe and the F-18C and the Su-30 are released, we do see things start to change a little bit as far as the proportions go. It's a little bit hard to see in this chart because our scale on the left-hand side has changed, but the popularity of the F-16C has gone down a little bit. The popularity of the Eurofighters has gone down a little bit. The American stuff, its decrease is kind of to be expected with the addition of the F-18C, because the F-18C is kind of in the middle of the chart, and you can kind of just push it all the way to the left and kind of add it to the total of American stuff, where in this time frame, at least as far as the proportion of games is concerned, as far as the number of games compared to the total for that month, America is still relatively popular. The other thing to kind of note is the Su-27, the Su-30. The number of Su-27 games doesn't really offset the number of Su-30 games. You don't really see a lot of people going directly from one plane to the other. At least it's not showing up in the data yet. It really isn't until the April to May timeframe, and with the build event going on, that we see numbers start to flip flop. We see that the Su-30 has replaced the Su-27 as the most popular, and in total, the Su-27 represents around 15% of total games. The F-16C, on the other hand, has dropped well below 20%, and the F-18C has shot up, but it hasn't really shot up enough to really offset the decline in American numbers. At the same time, the Eurofighter numbers and the Rafale numbers have declined a little bit, but really there isn't as big of a jump from the first month to the second month as there is from the second month to the third month. Proportionally speaking, this is probably the most balanced that top tier sim has ever been. Now, if we take all three of these graphs and we put them side by side and we try to compare them, we're not going to get a good comparison because the scale on the left-hand side changes. So it always looks like America's outpacing everyone, but you have to pay attention to the numbers. The numbers on the left-hand side change. And overall, in the past 3 months, the proportion of players that are playing on each side has changed, but that doesn't actually tell the full story. The much larger picture appears to be that overall, across the board, as far as top tier is concerned, the number of games that are being played per month is in decline. That if you look at all of the planes, if you look at all of the data, pretty much everything that has not been added fairly recently is in decline, And not only is it in decline, it's not so much that F16 players are switching over to the F18 and they're playing that just as much as they used to. Those numbers don't actually offset the overall decline in the player population. In very technical terms, we actually do have about the same number of players on a monthly basis. But the thing is, when StatShark counts players on a monthly basis, they're going to count a guy that plays 1 game of Sim per month the same as a guy who plays 100 games of Sim per month. So I don't really like this first graph because it does squash everything together and causes a bunch of overlapping lines, but it really does give you perspective on how dominant the US and USSR player base are in terms of games played per month. And while the US and USSR player base are dominant in numbers, the overall numbers across the board are in significant decline on the order of around 30 to 40% in total. We can actually see this in action if we analyze a lot of the Delta Wing fighters, because what I did here is I indexed the February to March games as 100% and then compared the March to April and April to May games. And what I found is that the only plane that has proportionally increased in popularity, the only plane that has more games in the April to May timeframe versus the February to March timeframe, as far as the fighters that are on this graph, is the Japanese Gripen. Pretty much every other fighter across the board has had the number of games played in it decline by 40%. And some of these is understandable. Something like the Mirage 2005F becoming less popular as people unlock the Rafale and decide that the Rafale is better. That's understandable. But on the other hand, the Rafale has been buffed like 6 or 7 times since February to March. And even though it is currently the best plane in the game, people are even deciding to play that less and less. The number of Rafale games has declined by over 40%. We can also see the same phenomena in action if we analyze the teen series of fighters that are not the US ones, where if you look at the F-15J and the F-15 Ram, those planes declined in the number of games played on a monthly basis by around 50%. Pretty much everything across the board has declined. The only thing that has really increased in popularity or increased the number of games played per month are the brand new planes. Now, maybe the methodology of analyzing the game through the lens of just the number of games played per month is a little bit flawed. Maybe things have changed where people feel that the games that they're in are a little bit more competitive, things are a little bit more equitable, that they're playing the same amount of time, but they're sticking to the same game for longer. Instead of doing 3 lobbies and doing 30 minutes apiece, they're doing 1 lobby and they're doing it for an hour and a half. Well, there's no real data to support that. The two things that I think of that can come close to kind of approximating that is going to be in terms of kills per battle and deaths per battle. And let me explain what I mean by that. Basically, in the ideal situation where we have perfectly balanced teams, where everyone's kind of going 1-to-1, going even, where you get like where the margins where you win or lose on a close fight is like just by the skin of your teeth, and you're like, oh, I can bring it back. I'm gonna go back at it. I'm gonna go back and do it. In that case, if we were spending a long time in individual matches, we would both have high kills per battle, and we would have high deaths per battle. And if things had changed, and if things were different, if player activity changed, we would expect to see changes in terms of kills per battle and deaths per battle, at least if we analyze Sim as a pure player versus player mode. Yes, I understand that we can also analyze the amount of ground targets destroyed per battle, the RP per battle, that kind of thing, but then that spreadsheet gets way, way, way too long. Now, when I crunched the kills per battle and deaths per battle numbers together and tried to look at trends over time, I didn't really find anything that was all that insightful. There was nothing that I saw that we could draw like a really hard conclusion on. In some cases, we could maybe say that for individual planes, the in-game activity declined by 20 to 25%, and maybe you can extrapolate that teams now collapse faster when they get pressured, but I really don't think the fidelity of the data is there to really draw any hard conclusions from this data. But I did look at it. I did find it insightful that insofar as that it appears that the average amount of in-game activity on a month-to-month basis is, I would say, just kind of overall is just more or less the same. People are going to generally get around 2.5 to 4 kills per battle, depending on how strong their plane is, and they're generally going to leave on average after around 3 deaths or so. And this is the part of the video where things get exceptionally bleak. This is the part of the video where I get to tell you that there is no God, nobody is coming to save you, everything is darkness. Because if you look at the data and you only analyze it through the lens of top tier, it's really easy to craft a really compelling narrative that red teams were so disadvantaged for so long, and then as soon as they got a competitive plane, uh, the blue team guys, they quit and they switch sides and they don't want to play the game, and et cetera, et cetera. And if this problem was limited to top tier and you only saw these changes at top tier, you could make the case for that. But because I'm a studious student who tries to be smart and thorough, I kind of looked at some of the other metrics, because one of the alternative theories is like, hey, the blue team guys, they're not winning at top tier anymore, so they reverted to 12.7 because the F-18 and all that other stuff is better, and they need to have easy mode matchmaker to do good. Well, guess what? This is what 12.7 looks like. 12.7, massive declines on par with pretty much everything else. The amount of games played per month is in decline. You do see a little bit of a pickup from people picking up the premium F-18, but overall, the grand perspective is people are playing sim less. This trend is even true when you look at your premium grinder mobiles, things like the Mirage F1C, the MiG-23ML, and the F4S. These planes, you would expect to see an uptick in the activity from the build event where people were grinding for the Meteor Mark 8. And you really just didn't see that in this cycle. You just saw pretty much a steady decline where something like the F4S, the plane that is one of the most popular planes in Sim, went from around 140,000 games all the way down to just below 60,000. That is a huge, huge decline. And this is the part of the video where things get to go from being dire to being apocalyptic. This is where I get to tell you that there is no God, where no part of the game is safe, because the last remaining refuge of true simulator aficionados is experiencing basically the same phenomenon. If you look at a lot of the popular props from a couple of months ago and compare them to today, the number of games that are being played in props, the part of the game that, mind you, is probably the most well-established, the one that has the most devoted fan base that like enjoys the game for the sake of the game, because the prop meta is not changing anytime soon. Guess what? That is also in decline, and it is not in decline by insignificant numbers. Anyways, that's going to be all the information I provide tonight, because the video is already about 20 minutes long, and I don't really want to extend my time awake to go in depth of why I think things are the way that they are. So we're just going to skip to the end of a very, very typical top tier game where I get a guy on the radar and he just, I don't know, just split S's into the water, because, you know, having a map with terrain on it would be too much to play on, because that would be real bad. And then we're just going to skip ahead to the end of this real fun, gripping game on Denmark. It's super duper fun. Oh no, we got hit and he got hit, and then we got the final blow, and the game's over. 23-7. I spent literally twice as much time in this game as the average person does in a top tier game. And thank God it's over, because I hate Denmark. I don't want to play the game on Denmark. I wonder why people are playing the game less and don't enjoy playing it. Does it have anything to do with the preponderance of people to pick the thing that they said that they hated, and oh boy, look at all these games we got there. It's all fucking goddamn Denmark. I'm so sick of Denmark. Nuke Denmark, delete Denmark, get rid of Denmark. I don't want to play the game on Denmark. Thank you. That's a Beer Thunder. And I appreciate all of the wonderful comments that I'm sure that you'll leave in the video.